Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen. Today my guest is Norman Podhoretz, one of the founding fathers of the neoconservative movement, a long-standing editor-in-chief of Commentary magazine, and author of numerous books on political and cultural subjects. His most recent book is World War IV, The Long Struggle Against Islamofascism. Norman Podhoretz, welcome to the Drexel interview.
I'm glad to be here.
As I said, you've been called the father, and in some quarters the patriarch, of the neoconservative movement. And I wonder if you would tell us first how a neoconservative differs from an old-style conservative.
Well, the neoconservatives, as the prefix neo indicates, means new, of course, new conservatives. Were all people, intellectuals, who had started their political lives on the left, some to the far left, others the near left, so to speak. And in the 1960s, in response to what I think of as the depredations of the radical movement that I myself helped to create and propagate, a number of people, quite independently, there was no movement, no organization, began getting disillusioned with a lot of what was going on the left and some of their own ideas, and began rethinking as a result of this experience. And this led over the course of a fairly long period. I often tell people there was no St. Paul on the road to Damascus conversion. There was no bolt of lightning. It was a process of reflection and reconsideration. Revaluation, as one of my old teachers used to say, and lasted 4 or 5 years, starting in the late 60s and more or less completed in the early 70s.
So you began as a radical, would you say a radical leftist?
Yeah, well, certainly. I began as what they used to call a Cold War liberal when I was a student at Columbia and after World War II, and I did become a radical. Kind of non-sectarian radical. I mean, I was not a communist or a Trotskyist. I read everywhere that I was a Trotskyist. I never.
You didn't join any party.
No. Yeah. And I was, if anything, I was attracted to utopian, what I would now consider delusions about the perfectibility of our society. But I had a lot to do with the formation of what came to be called the New Left. I knew practically everybody involved in the early days, and I, as editor of Commentary, which I took over in 1960, I published many of the leading figures of the New Left, many of them by now mercifully forgotten.
Well, I want to get into that part of your history, but before I do, I wonder if you'd say a few words about this new book that you have just written, in which, if I could just summarize, you argue that Islamic extremism is the latest threat to democracy. World War IV follows after other world wars that have been in opposition to extremism that tries to destroy the democratic way of life. What would you define Islamofascism as being, and why do you put it on a par with Nazism and communism? Well,
let me back up and explain why I call this World War IV, and then I'll answer that part of your question. As you rightly said, I see Islamofascism, what I call Islamofascism, as the direct successor to the two previous totalitarian challenges to our civilization. The first one came from the right in the form of Nazism, and we took that on in World War II and defeated it. No sooner was that threat defeated than another one arose, this one coming at us from the left in the form of communism and embodied most powerfully in the Soviet Empire. We took that one on in what came to be called the Cold War, but what I now think in retrospect should be understood, seen as World War III. We were only involved in World War II for 4 years. World War III lasted for 42 years, from 1947 with the enunciation of the Truman Doctrine, ended in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now I see what happened after 9/11, that is our response to 9/11, as our nation rising to the new challenge, the new totalitarian challenge that came at us not from the left, excuse me, or not from the right, but from the 7th century. Although Islamofascism is not the same thing as Islam, it's a political movement within Islam, and was actually born in the 20th century. And what's fascinating is that by its own account, it was schooled at the feet first of the Nazis when the Germans moved into the Middle East during World War II. And the Ba'athist parties that ruled, still rule Syria and that ruled Iraq under Saddam Hussein, both modeled their political movements after the Nazi Party. And then after World War II, the Russians moved into the region, and the despots of that region went, so to speak, to graduate school with the communists, with the Russians, and they learned a lot from them too. So this political movement, although originating in ancient times, anyway, the 7th century, was a creation of the 20th century. And what it represents is a coming together of a religious totalitarian force, the Islamist radical movement that was most clearly embodied in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which of course we overthrew in the aftermath of 9/11, and it also has a secular face. It's a two-headed monster, and the secular face was most forcefully represented by the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And having deposed the Taliban regime, we then, the religious component, we then went after the secular head. And the purpose was, as I like to summarize it, the strategic intention and objective was and remains to make the Middle East safe for America by making it safe for democracy. And this means regime changes in all the despotisms of the region, whether they be secular or religious, and setting them on the road to democratization by various means.
I guess I'll interrupt you here. I'm not really in a position to critique the nuances of your argument. I think they're theoretically, I see the trajectory that you're tracing here. But let me just ask you a few things that come to mind. Number one, I was struck in reading your book by your reverence for President Bush and the Bush Doctrine, as you call it. And also your interest in ideas. Just now, in discussing this historical development, you're speaking theoretically. And yet, I can't help but ask you how you can revere a man who doesn't appear to have ideas or understand the nuances of ideas. I mean, putting aside the, other critiques I might have of what you said, I think the argument wavers when you call Bush not only a brilliant, you call him a brilliant thinker, a brilliant strategist.
No, I don't call him a brilliant thinker. I call him a great president.
And eloquent.
Well,
you compare him to Churchill, and you quote words that are hollow facsimiles to me of what Churchill said, that are merely mouthing the same content without the eloquence, without the awareness of the ideas.
Well,
and I don't know if I'm putting this well.
Well, this is a two-sided question. I believe that George Bush will someday be recognized as a great president for the same reason that Harry Truman, who was even more unpopular and more derided when he was at this stage of his own presidency. His ratings, incidentally, were in the low 20s, 10 points lower than Bush's.
So you do make that parallel between Truman and Bush.
And the parallel is both situational, so to speak, and symmetrical. Look, the reason people now look back at Truman and regard him as a great president, when if you told people in 1952 that Harry Truman would someday be recognized as a great president, they really would have thought you were nuts. But the reason that everybody has come to recognize his stature is that he, at a time when many people were poo-pooing the Soviet threat, denying that there was such a threat, he recognized the dimensions of it, and he rose to it, and he designed or helped design or signed off on a strategy for coping with it. The strategy was first enunciated in the Truman Doctrine, so-called. It was got to be known as containment, and with many ups and downs and much conflict within the country and many mistakes. In the end, it was what brought us to brought the World War III, the Cold War, to a victorious end. I see George W. Bush as having done almost exactly the same thing in relation to the Islamofascist threat, which he not only recognized but took the measure of after 9/11, and he also has designed a strategy for coping with it.
But the idea of containment, which Truman seemed to suggest, I mean, the Islamofascist threat has not been contained. If anything, it seems to have spread.
It can't be contained. That's one of the points of the Bush Doctrine. You cannot contain a force which, first of all, is not only willing but eager to die for its beliefs, and you can't contain a force which doesn't have particular territory that it worries about preserving. And what was needed was precisely the recognition that containment was no longer relevant and that you needed a new approach, which George W. Bush has not only designed but followed with great conviction.
You don't think it's odd that
courage.
So many, even people on your side of the fence politically, have seem to feel that he's botched the job or is repudiated?
I go back to Truman. Everybody said the same thing about Truman. I mean, I was just a kid. I mean, I was only 17 when Truman enunciated the doctrine. But I well remember the derision that was directed, especially among intellectuals.
Right. But you don't feel, and I don't want to belabor this because I do want to get on to other aspects of your life, you don't feel there is a difference when you think, I'm sure Truman was derided, and yet listening or reading Truman's speeches, there's a homespun, basic, solid intelligence operating there.
Not his speeches. It was more his off-the-cuff
you sense the man had some quality.
I totally disagree with you, and I speak here as an old, sometime literary critic, and I argue with you on literary grounds. I think a series of speeches from which I quote extensively in my book, starting with the one immediately after September 11, and it's about 8 of them really, I think are among the greatest presidential speeches in our history, and I would be prepared to defend that with new critical analysis.
We're coming at this from very different places because I've heard those speeches too, and I must say that they were hard for me to listen to.
Yeah.
Not so much because they were badly written, but because of the way they were articulated but they weren't written by George W. Bush.
Doesn't matter.
Does it matter?
No president since Lincoln has written his own speeches. Maybe Woodrow Wilson did occasionally. I mean, presidents do not write their own speeches, period. So,
but they get credit for them, I guess,
because they sign off on them and by putting
but
their names.
But even the delivery is so lousy.
You know something? Some of the most articulate people who deliver speeches most brilliantly and forcefully are among the worst people I've ever known in my life. I don't consider that talent a necessary quality in a great leader.
That's well taken. I will agree that some of the more fluent people are not necessarily the most trustworthy. But I want to talk about your background. I've been interested in you for a long time. As I told you before, my father was a subscriber to Commentary, and it was always lying around the house. And your name was mispronounced constantly as Podhoretz and not Podhoretz. But you were a name in our family that, we talked about your articles. You grew up in Brooklyn in a rather poor immigrant Jewish family. You went on to Columbia University, and then you got your master's at Cambridge. But it was Lionel Trilling,